Let's look at number 9. What's the role played in the argument by the first statement of the argument? The first sentence of the argument is the one that the question is about. So let's read the paragraph. The purpose of a law, here's the statement that we're looking at, the purpose of a law is to deter certain actions by threatening to punish the people who perform those actions. That makes sense. That's why we have laws, to deter people from doing things by punishing people who do those things. This threat that we just mentioned in sentence 1, that only works if potential violators actually think that there's a chance that there's likely to be punishment. But that likelihood that someone will actually be apprehended and punished for committing a crime decreases as the number of types of prohibited actions increases. In other words, the more things that we prohibit, the less likely people think they're going to get caught, because they're like, oh, there's a million things that are prohibited anyway. They're not going to catch everyone who does all those things. So the more types of prohibited things there are, the less likely a person thinks they're going to get caught. And according to sentence 1, the whole purpose of a law is to make you not want to do something because you're scared of getting caught. So if we put everything together, the conclusion is now in the last sentence, therefore, a successful legal system would only prohibit those few behaviors that citizens find the most absolutely intolerable. In other words, we should be selective. In order to be a successful legal system, we should be selective about the types of things that we prohibit. Now, that was clearly the conclusion, right? It was preceded by the word therefore, right? Everything that we said above is brought as support to say, therefore, if you want to have a successful legal system, don't prohibit too many things. So how did that first sentence factor in? Well, very simple. That first sentence was part of the support. It was a premise brought for this conclusion, right? Because we needed to know that in order to prove this conclusion. The sentence in the beginning of the paragraph says that the reason we have laws is to deter people, and then the next middle part of the paragraph then goes on to say, however, if you prohibit too many things, you're not going to deter them, right? People are not going to think they're going to get caught if there's too many things that are prohibited. So therefore, if you put all those things together, therefore, the conclusion very logically states that if you want to fulfill the purpose in sentence 1, if you want to actually do that thing, if you want to have a successful legal system, then you shouldn't prohibit too many types of different things. So if you put sentence 1 and sentence 2 together, those were both brought as support for the conclusion. So let's look for something very simple in the answer choices, that this sentence was brought as partial support or premise for the conclusion. A says that this statement was brought as support of the implied conclusion, the implicit conclusion that wasn't stated, but it was implied that a legal system needs a lot of police officers. First of all, where was that implied in this paragraph, that we need a lot of police officers? Nothing in this paragraph talked about or hinted at how big of a police force you need, right? So there was nothing of that sort that was implied, and therefore this statement could not have been brought as support for this implicit conclusion that didn't really exist, right? As we were reading this paragraph, we didn't say or think anything about how many police officers you need for a successful legal system. So therefore A is totally coming out of left field and wrong. B, I think it's clearly not the conclusion of the argument, because the conclusion of the argument is the last sentence, as evidenced by the fact that it's preceded by the word therefore. That very frequently is going to introduce the conclusion, right? And the first sentence was not the conclusion, right? The first sentence was a premise. It's telling you, here's what the purpose of a law is. And we use that as a premise to prove the conclusion, which is that if you want to fulfill the purpose, if you want to have a successful legal system where you fulfill that purpose that we just mentioned in sentence 1, then here's the argument, here's the conclusion, then you should act a certain way. You should only prohibit some things but not prohibit other things. Why? Because the purpose of a law, because sentence 1, the purpose of a law is to deter certain actions, and sentence 2, if you prohibit too many things, you're not going to deter those actions. So therefore, if you put all that together, then therefore, if you want to fulfill your purpose, if you want to have a successful legal system, then you should not prohibit too many things. So it wasn't the main conclusion. We didn't bring support for sentence 1. We didn't bring any evidence for sentence 1, which would have had to be the case if it was the conclusion, right? The conclusion has to have support or evidence brought for it. We never brought any support. We just took that for granted. We just told you in sentence 1, the purpose of a law is to deter people from doing things. We didn't bring support for that. We rather brought that as support for a conclusion about how we should design a successful legal system. So B certainly is not correct. C, very simple. Yes, it is a premise in the argument, right? It's a premise because it says, here's what the purpose of a law is. It's to deter people from doing things, right? And then sentence 2 says, however, you're not going to be able to successfully fulfill that purpose if you prohibit too many things. And therefore, the conclusion is, if you want to have a successful legal system, in other words, if you want to have a legal system that successfully fulfills its purpose, then you should only prohibit a few things. Why? Because sentence 1, because the purpose is to deter people. And sentence 2, if you prohibit too many things, you're not going to deter people. So we needed to know that the purpose is to deter people. And we also needed to know sentence 2, that you're not going to deter people if you prohibit too many things. We needed to know both of those things in order to prove the conclusion, which is that therefore, if you want to fulfill the purpose, if you want to have a successful legal system, successful means fulfilling its purpose, right? If you want to have a successful legal system, then according to sentences 1 and 2, according to those premises, you shouldn't prohibit too many things. You should only prohibit those few behaviors that citizens find absolutely intolerable. So yes, C, it is a premise brought for the conclusion in the final sentence. Therefore, it is correct. C is the correct answer. D says that it was an intermediate conclusion. Now, in order for something to be an intermediate conclusion, it needs to be something that support was brought for, and it in turn was brought in support for the conclusion. So you have a 3-step process. You have support brought for a mini intermediate or subsidiary conclusion, and then that conclusion then pivots and is used as support for the final conclusion. The problem is this statement, this first sentence of the paragraph, yes, it was brought as support for the conclusion, but it didn't have support brought for it. So it fulfilled one of those two things, but not the other. There's no support brought for sentence 1. We never bring evidence as to what the purpose of a law is, right? We just stated, we just took for granted in the argument, we just granted that the purpose of a law is to deter certain actions by threatening people who perform those actions. Now, we never brought support for that. We just stated that, and therefore it can't be an intermediate conclusion. E says that the whole point of the argument is to discredit this first sentence. It's to prove this first sentence wrong. That's absolutely not true. In fact, we use this first sentence as support for the conclusion, right? We never said that this is not true, right? In fact, it's the author, it's the narrator of the paragraph speaking when they say the purpose of a law is to deter certain actions, right? They just state it outright. They're not trying to discredit it. They state it as if it's a fact. They state it as if it's true, and they use it as support for the conclusion. So it's certainly not something that the argument's trying to discredit. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.